All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Bracha Strimber, for dedicating all the Shur and Drushos this month in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham, Ben Kallman, Eli'ezer, Halevi, Zichron Levrach. We open on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah, and the family a Nechama. We thank Avi Tobias for dedicating all the Shur and Drushos this month in appreciation for the Shir and for the Ribbano Shalom incredible Torah. All right, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us. Today's daf is daf Vav. We are picking up 6. We are picking up on Ham and Beis. We left off Beis HaPras. So it's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, about 22, 23 lines off from the bottom. So the Gemara says, Beis HaPras min metame bo'el. So we'll say, remember again, the Gemara says, a Beis HaPras, which we defined yesterday as a field in which there was a grave. The grave was plowed over. So now what's the concern in a Beis HaPras? The concern is bone fragments. Bone fragments scattered throughout the field. So we'll say, the Gemara says, but 1 second. Could a Beis HaPras convey tumas ohel? Now, just we have our terms correct over here. Remember, tumas ohel is the type of tumah that you contract. Paradigmatic case of tumas ohel is I'm under the same roof with a corpse, right? But again, perhaps not more common, but another form of tumas ohel is how I'm walking and I bend over, right? I lean over a corpse, or I lean over a source of tumah. In which case, again, by leaning over, I am the ohel. So that's right. It's interesting. There's 2 different types of ohel. There's you could be under an ohel, or you can be the ohel. So the Gemara says, "Ubeis haras min tame ba'ohel." Does a beis hapras convey tumas ohel? V'ha'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel menafeach adam beis hapras v'holech. We'll say, interestingly enough, we've seen this before. That Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel. There is a way to traverse a beis hapras. How do you traverse a beis hapras? We'll say how. Very slowly, right? Very slowly and methodically, literally blowing the dirt in front of you as you walk. Because again, what's the logic behind that? If there is a bone fragment, you'll see it. Because we'll say the good thing about a Beis HaPras is that there is a bone fragment. Where is the bone fragment? Where is it? It's usually on the upper layer of soot. Because remember again, the whole chap of a Beis HaPras is they plowed over a grave, which means they uprooted the grave, and therefore the bone fragments are still by the top of the soil. So the Gemara says, "V'holech Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami b'shmei du'ula amar Beis HaPras shenido shtar." That was if a Beis HaPras that ultimately was plowed is really tar. Amar Papa lo kashya kan b'sada sha'avad ba'kever kan b'sada shenechrash ba'kever. Oh, so Rabbi say this is actually very interesting. So apparently there are 2 different types of Beis HaPras. There's a Beis HaPras shenechrash ba'kever. So we'll say that's a Beis HaPras where there was a kever. The kever was plowed over. Versus a Beis HaPras where I know there was a grave in this field. I just don't know what. I don't know where it is. We'll say take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, this is the last short line of Rashi. B'sada sha'avar ba'kever katani demetzainin temetame ba'ohel. So I will say, if you have a field in which a grave was lost, that's where the Bracha said that you have to go ahead and mark that field, because I know that halacha l'maaseh there is a grave in there, and that type of field therefore could convey tumas ohel. Aval b'sada shenechrash ba'kever in tzarich l'tzayim v'lo matami ba'ohel de'neima macharisha salki l'tumas. Also, what the Gemara is suggesting right now is as follows. If you have a field in which you know there was a grave, but the grave was plowed over, we're not worried about that. Because even though there may be bone fragments, we assume that the fragments are so small that Allah they're not going to convey tumas ohel. Masha'en came when there was a grave there and the grave was lost, then we have a significant concern. Because I know that there is an intact grave in that field, and I don't know where it is. That's where the field has to be actively marked. 1 second. A field in which you lost the kever, right? So a field in which there was a grave, but now the grave has been lost. That's called a Beis HaPras. That, as the Gemara says, in Vatana we learned, Shlosha Beis HaPras hein. There are 3 different types of Beis HaPras. Sodeh shene'evad ba kever, right? A field in which you lost the kever. V'sadeh shenechrash ba kever, a field in which the grave was plowed over. V'sadeh bochin, And the field, right, a bochen field. They both say bochen literally means crying. So what's a sadeh bochen? They both say this is fascinating. So the Gemara says, my sadeh bochen, Rabbi Yeshua bar Av Mishay De'ula Amar sadeh shemaftirin b'mesim. It's the field in which we take leave of the dead. So we'll say, watch this. This is absolutely fascinating. Look at Rashi, second wide line in Rashi. Shemaftirin b'mesim, kishemaviyin mesim mimakom lemakom likbar. So let's listen to this. Sometimes you would transport a corpse, right, from what city A to city B, right? The person passed away in city A, but burial was going to be in city B. So what happens? So when they would come to a field, that was close to city B. Niftarin elu sheviom mimkoman v'holchin lahen uban anshe maka umekablen osan v'rochtzin oso sham v'kovrin osan. So we'll say this is fascinating. So what happened is they used to have a field. We'll call it like a transfer field. And what would happen is the people from city A would bring the corpse from city A to this field. The residents of city B, let's say the Chaver Kadisha of city B would come. They would receive the body in that field. That's where they would perform the Tara. That's where they would wash the body, ready the body for burial, and then afterwards bury it. Lav dafka they would bury in that field. But that would be, so they called Sadeh Bochen. Right? Sadeh Bochen. That would be the transfer field. So that's also called a Beis HaPras. So Rabbi says, the Gemara is suggesting over here three different types of Beis HaPras. A field in which a kever was lost, a field in which a kever was plowed over, and Sadeh Bochen. The time of my Amravi Mishum Yeush Bailim Nogaba. They will say, by the way, just that last one, why is that called the Beis HaPras? In other words, they will say, I understand the first two, right? Where the grave was lost, that's a problem, because now there is an intact grave somewhere in that field. When the grave was plowed over, the concern is what? Bone fragments that are large enough to convey tumah. But what's the problem with Sadeh Bochen? Right? What's the problem with the transfer field? So what's interesting enough, the Gemara says the problem with it is that sometimes halacha lamaisa, the corpse could be decomposing, and a limb could be lost. And perhaps they're not cognizant of the loss of a limb, and so a limb could remain behind in that field. So you could have a source of intact tumah in that field as well. So the Gemara says, Shabbos says, therefore again, halacha lamaisa, these are the three different types of Beis HaPras. The sadeh shenechrash ba'kever lo bayitzin. So what the Gemara is saying over here, what it sounds like, based on the Brisa, based on what we said before, is that a field that has a plowed over grave does not need a marker. Right? So when we say marker, remember again, the marker we're talking about is what? A stone covered in white plaster that alerts people to the presence of tumah. So the Gemara says, is that true? That a field that has a plowed over grave doesn't require a marker? V'hatani, we learned, so this is a fascinating case. Let's say you find a field with a marker. So the easiest way kind of to think about this is, imagine you find a field, but a demarcated field. It could be a simple case. You find a field with a fence around it, but it's not a Rishus HaYachid, right? You find a field with a fence, or with a tree line around it, and you find a stone with white plaster by that field. Okay? So here's the problem. You don't know what that means. So here's what I know. I know that I have a field, and by the entranceway to that field, I have a white stone. So, right? So the Gemara says, so yesh ba'ilanos, if the field has trees, so we'll say, if it has trees, then I know, what does that mean? What does that stone mean? That means there was a grave here, the grave was plowed over. The grave was plowed over. Ein ba'ilanos, if it doesn't have trees, that shows me that what? There is an intact grave here, but the location of the grave is unknown. Now I will say, I don't understand, what does trees have to do with this? It's very simple. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, it's in the wide lines of Rashi, about 5 lines in. So remember again, I will say, we have 2 different types of Beis HaPras. Right? One type is where there's an intact grave that was lost. The second type is when the grave was plowed over. So what's the nafkamina between those two? What's the nafkamina between those 2 fields? Very significant. What's the nafkamina? How do you, or can you traverse it? Remember again, if it's plowed over, I could traverse it how? Like we said before, slowly, by blowing on the dirt in front of me to reveal bone fragments. If it's a field with an intact grave that's lost, I can't go in. Or as we say, I can't go in, I'm just going to become tamei. Right? Because I don't know where the intact grave is. So the Gemara says, here's the way to tell the difference. Look here, Rashi. Yesh ba'ilana she'adu benechrash. If there are trees planted in the field, this means that this was a field that had a grave that was plowed over. Hasad l'tzarech ilana, so yachal lahalech she'enu metamei ba'ohel. Alma mediktani matzah about sad mitzianes. They might see them maybe. So the ideal here is if you find trees. See, I will say the Gemara says the only way to plant trees is how to plow the field, which means that it is a field that had a grave and the grave was plowed over. That's how the trees are there, because somebody plowed and somebody planted trees. So therefore, I will say, what does that tell me? That tells me I can walk through it. I just have to what? Blow on the dirt before I walk through to expose any bone fragments. But I will say, but what do you see from here? You see from here that you do put a marker, even by a beis hapras that has a plowed over grave. However, if it doesn't have trees, then that tells me that what? There is an intact grave in this area, but the location of the intact grave has been lost. But I will say, but our point over here is you see from here that halacha l'maisa, you in fact do put a marker with all of these types of fields. So Rabbi Huda says, Achi Hesham Zakin O Talmud, Lefi She'in Hakol Bekin B'Dav. Rabbi Huda says, no. Halacha l'maisa, the truth is, if you look at Rashi says, Rabbi Huda Omer, the Olom L'Havi B'Cheska Shenechrash, Achi Hesham Zakin O Talmud Chacham She'odesh Nechrash. A field does not have the status of a field that has a plowed over grave, unless there's someone who could tell you that with some level of certainty. Right? And what Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying is that halacha l'maisa, if you see a field with a marker, the greater probability is that there's an intact grave that was lost. The only time we go ahead and we say that the field has a grave that was plowed over is when there's someone there who could ascertain or who could vouch for those facts. Amra Papa, ki tanyahi, besadeh sha'avad ba'kever, ditsainuha. Rav Abba says, no, what are we talking about? We're talking about over here a case where there is an intact grave. In other words, we both say, the Gemara is not telling you, in a case of a regular beis hapras, where there was a plowed over grave, you don't have to mark that, but rather, again, because there's a way to traverse that field, albeit slowly and methodically. The only time you have to mark a field is when halacha l'maisa there is a lost intact grave. So Rav Papa says like this, the Bryce is talking about a case where there is a lost intact grave. And therefore, they marked the grave with a stone with white plaster. Yesh ba'ilanos. So if ultimately, again, it has trees, you know that after the fact, the field was plowed, and therefore the grave was plowed over. So the Gemara says, Ein ba'ilanos, if it doesn't have trees, that tells you it hasn't been plowed over, and it is a field with an intact grave. But I will say, even with the trees, perhaps again the trees just tell me. Perhaps the grave is on the outside and the trees are in the inside. In other words, maybe the grave is on the outside of the trees. No, we're talking about trees that are planted around the perimeter of the field. Top above. So maybe again the tumah is on the inside, and ultimately again the trees on the outside. To which the Gemara said, ultimately we're talking about thickly or densely planted trees. So what's the other possibility is, remember again, we wouldn't plant trees that way if the trees are there to demarcate tumah, as you saw in yesterday's daf. Rabbi said that whenever you're planting or creating something as a demarcation for tumah, you have to be what? There's this balance. What's the balance, Rabbi say? We don't go ahead and make the siman, or the right, we'll call it the tziyun, right on top of the tumah, because what's the concern there? The concern is that a person will only realize that they're next to tumah by the time it's too late, but we also don't space it out too much in order not to unnecessarily cause the loss of agricultural land in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Huda Omer, Rabbi Huda says, Achi Hesham Zakin O Talmud. So Rabbi Huda says, if you see a field with a marker, the automatic assumption is that halacha l'maisa, there's an intact grave in that field, just the exact location is lost. Until you have either a zakin or a talmud chacham who could tell you exactly that the field was plowed over. Why? Abai says, what do you see from here? Shmamina, Surah Merabanan, Diika Bemasa. You see from say that when a city has a Talmud Chacham in a particular place, Komili Dimasa Ale Ramya. All the matters of this city are upon it. So in other words, interesting idea that you think to yourself, why does the Talmud Chacham, right? Why does the Talmud Chacham, right? The Rav in the city, why does he have to know where the grave is? To which the Gemara says, you see from here, because the Rav of a city is responsible for everything, right? Everything rests on his shoulders. So the Gemara says, even the idea over here that even if there was a grave and it was plowed over, that's his responsibility to know. Incredible. So the Gemara says, I'm going to be Yehuda. So we'll say, so fine. Just want to point out. So therefore, what we have over here is as follows so far. So here are the takeaway points to remember. Takeaway points to remember will say is that there are three forms of Beis HaPras, right? Three forms of Beis HaPras. Number one, a field in which a kever was lost, the grave is intact, but the location is lost. That's the most intense, because there, I will say, essentially, we have to pretty much, in other words, if you're makbid on Tuman Tara, you pretty much can't go through that field. Because there's no way to know where the grave is. That's case number one. Case number two is a field that had a grave, but what? The grave was plowed over, in which case, again, there is a concern for bone fragments everywhere. The good news is, if there are bone fragments, they're on the top level of soil, and there is a way to traverse that field. How? Slowly, methodically, by blowing away the dirt in front of you, thereby exposing any bone fragments. Case number three is what we call Sadeh Bochin, which we're introduced to in today's daf, which is this exchange field, right? This Chevra Kadisha field, where then when they were transferring a body from city A to city B, they would leave the body in the field. Now, in other words, they would transfer the body to the Chevra Kadisha of city B. City B would often perform the Tara in that field. There's a concern in that field that maybe if the body is decomposing, a limb would be lost and the Chevra Kadisha would not be cognizant of it. And remember again, an intact limb could go ahead and convey tumah. So those are our three different forms of Beis HaPras. Based on this Gemara, it appears that halacha l'maisa, you have to make a marker in all of those types of a Beis HaPras. Good. But the other thing we've learned is that when making a tziyun, we're making a marker to alert travelers to the presence of a grave. One has to be careful not to make the marker too exact. Can't be too exact, otherwise a person won't realize that it's a grave until it's too late and they're on top of it. You also can't make it too big in order not to go ahead and cause the unnecessary loss of agricultural land in Eretz Yisrael. Beautiful. A few more halachas, I will say. Samar Rav Yehuda, Matzah Evan Mitsuyanes Tachta Tameh. So let's listen to this. If you find, Evan Mitsuyanes just means a demarcation stone. So I'll say, if you find a stone that's coated with white plaster, because that's how they used to mark a grave. So if you find an Evan Mitsuyanes, Tachta, the area underneath the stone is Tameh. We assume that stone alerts you to the presence of a corpse underneath it. Now watch this. Shtayim. Rabbi said, listen to this interesting case. Let's say you find two stones, right? Two stones across from each other. So say, so now, so the shaila is, what does that mean? So we'll say, let's talk about the possibilities. What are the possibilities? Possibilities that there's two graves, one under each stone, or what's the other possibility? That actually, the area that's being demarcated here is not the area underneath the stones, but what? The area between the stones. So watch this. So the Gemara says, it's very simple. Im yesh sid beinehen tameh, v'im ein sid beinehen tar. So I'll say it's a very simple case. So how do you determine it? Again, if you have two stones and the area between them was tameh, then that area would have been demarcated with plaster as well. Others will say that, again, if that's really what it was, that the two stones are kind of the bookends of the tumah, and the tumah extends between, they would have put plaster on that area in between as well. If that area in between the stones does not have plaster, that indicates to me the tumah is underneath the stones, but not between the stones. So the Gemara says, is that true even if the area was not plowed? Rashi says, it's actually right across in Rashi. So is that true? Even if the area wasn't plowed, right in between them, then Allah Lamaisa, we assume that there's no tumah in between the stones. But Tanya, we learned, Matza Evan Achas Mitsuyenes, if you find one stone, a one stone marker, Tachtea Tameh, then you say, again, that stone tells me that underneath the stone is tumah. Shtayim, what happens if you find two stones? Im yesh choresh beinehen tar, if the area in between the stones is plowed, then the area in between the stones is tahar, right? And what that means, the area in between the stones is tahar, but what? The area under the stones themselves is going to be tameh. Ve'im lav, but I will say, listen to this. If the area in between the stones has never been plowed, ve'im lav beinehen tameh. Because I will say, the fact that the area in between the stones has not been plowed tells me that what? That there's tumah, there must be tumah between the stones. But remember again, I want to point out, all of these cases, we're talking about where these markers are found in agricultural areas, right? That's what's happening over here, right? Because obviously, if it's not an agricultural area, the fact that it's not plowed is not a raya. This is all being found in agricultural fields. That's why, again, the Gemara says, when making the markers, be careful not to make the markers too big so as not to go ahead and cause the loss of usable soil, of agricultural soil. So also listen to this. Now the Gemara says over here that if you have the two markers, the two stones, if the area between them has been plowed, that's an indication that the area is taller. But if the area between the stones has never been plowed, that's a pretty good indication that what? That there's a grave there. Right? For the fact that it's never been plowed tells me that there's something or someone buried there. So the Gemara says, Papa, no. Hacha kishasid shafach aroshein umeruda lekan lekan. So I say, no, here's the case. The case is where you poured the plaster on the stones, and the plaster from the stones, it's clear, went onto the area in between the stones as well. Watch this. So the Gemara says, I'ika choresh beinehen tar. De'emar machmas choreshu de'ikbal. So listen to this. If the area between the stones is plowed, and you see some plaster on that area between the stones, we assume that plaster on the area between the stones came because maybe the plow rubbed against the stones, right? And rubbed off some of the plaster on the stones, and as a result, it's on the earth in between. However, the Gemara says, V'i lo, but again, if the area is not plowed, sid de beinihu vitame. Then ultimately, going to say, then what? Then halacha lamaisa, that must mean that plaster was put there initially, and that plaster was there to demarcate the fact that not only is the area underneath the stones tameh, but the area between the stones is going to be tameh as well. Incredible. So Amar Rabbi Asi, Meitzer Echad, Mitsuyan. So we'll say now another case. Fine, now another case. Halacha lamaisa. So essentially, by the way, it comes out in the two stone cases, if the area in between the two has plaster and has never been plowed, that's indicative of the fact that there is a grave there, that there's tumah there. But interestingly enough, if there's plaster there, but the area has been plowed, then we don't attribute the plaster to an intentional placement. Rather, we attribute that to what? To the fact that Allah Lamaisa, the plow scraped the stones, and that's why the plaster is there. Okay. Says the Gemara, listen to this case. Amabasi, Meitzer Echad Mitsuyan. So we'll say, here's another interesting case. This case over here is, if you can imagine you have a field. And I will say, let's say one side of the field has a tzio. So if you could imagine you have a field, let's just look at it as a square, and one side of the field has stones painted white. One side is Mitsuyan. So what's the halacha? Hu tameh. Okay, so obviously the demarcation of one side of the field tells me that the side of the field is going to be tameh, the rest of the field is tar. Shnayim, what happens if you have two sides of the field that are demarcated? Then ultimately, again, both of the sides are tameh, the rest of the field is tar. Shlosha, what happens if you have three sides of the field demarcated? I will say white stones along three sides of the field. Then ultimately, again, then we assume those three sides are tameh, the rest of the field is tar. Arba, what happens if I'll say if all four sides of the field are demarcated with white stones? Then what's the halach? Listen to this. Hein tahorin v'chala sada kula tameya. So this is interesting. If you have four sides of the field demarcated, then what we assume that means is that the 4 sides that are demarcated are actually the tahar parts, and the rest of the field is tameh, which is interesting. The Amar Mar ein marchikin sion mimakom toma shalahav seretz Eretz Yisrael. Because we learned that halacha lemaisa, you should not make the tzion too big in order not to go ahead and cause the loss of agricultural land. So in a case like this, so this is very interesting. In other words, the Gemara is saying in a case like this, where you see all 4 sides of the field painted white, so halacha lemaisa, again, what that's telling you is the entire interior of the field is tameh. The white represents the tahar parts of the field. And the reason we do that is because if you start making the markers on top of the field itself, what's going to end up happening? You're going to essentially end up losing out on the corners, on the edges. By demarcating the edges, you at least highlight the usable area of the field and don't cause a total loss for the field. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Rashi's right across. This is why in this case you demarcated all 4 corners to indicate the entire interior of the field is tameh. So as I saw again, in this case, all the Gemara is saying is, interestingly enough, in this case, it makes more sense to demarcate the usable area than it would to go ahead and put a tzion on top of the tameh area, because you would end up losing out on any potential agriculturally usable space. I don't know, but say it's interesting. This last piece is very interesting because halacha l'maisa, again, you could definitely see this creating incredible confusion. But I guess the notion of having all 4 sides of a field demarcated is such a strange thing, right? Such an aberration that as people would understand what that meant. Okay, fascinating halacha. Good. Rabbi say that brings to an end the exciting world of grave demarcations. Rabbi say with that, let us continue. V'yotz and afal kilayim. So Rabbi say, remember again the next piece of the Mishnah. Next piece of the Mishnah was that halacha l'maisa and chalamayid, Beis Din would also send out. There's actually, it's funny in this Gemara, I got this the last cycle of Daf Yomi, or 2 cycles, I can't remember. They have pictures, so I'll send it around. There's actually a good picture about this, of the grave demarcation. All of the cases of grave demarcation, there's a lot of good pictures. Okay, I'll send it out afterwards. In any event, so the Gemara says as follows. Remember, so in this case, we'll say the Mishnah said that on Chalamayid, we also send out, Beis Din sends out messengers to go ahead and inspect and potentially uproot forbidden mixtures in the field. Says the Gemara, is that true? That we go out for kilayim on Chalamayid, we wait till Chalamayid, or minu, on the 1st of Adar, we announce regarding the collection of the new machzis ashakal, we've seen this many times, the ala kilayim. And already the 1st of Adar, we make announcements for people to look at their fields to make sure that there's no forbidden mixtures. On the 15th of Adar, Koronas HaMegillah, it's Purim, Bikrachim, the Yotz in the Kabeis Es Hadrachim, and we already go out to cut back the thorn bushes on the pathways, Ulatakin Arachovos, and to fix the roads, V'lamod HaMikvos, and to measure the mikvos, to make sure they have the requisite amount of water, V'osin Kol Tzar Hirabim, and in general, we pay attention to all public works, right, to all matters of the public, Umitzainin Es HaKvaris, we make sure that the graves are properly marked, V'yotzin ala kilayim, and we go out to inspect about kilayim. Rabbi said, when is this happening? This is happening the 15th of Adar. Rabbi said the 15th of Adar is what? More than a month before Chalamayid. So the Mishnah makes it sound like the first time we're going out to inspect about kilayim is on Chalamayid, but it's not true. Already doing this Purim. It already starts Rosh Chodesh Adar, but it seems to be the active kilayim inspection takes place by Purim time. So what's going on over here? To which Gemara Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina Chadamar Kan Bebacher Kan Ba'afil. So we'll say 2 different interpretations, not a contradiction. We'll say one is talking about early plants, one is talking about late plants. In other words, we'll say depending on the kilayim, it sprouts at different times. So in Achinami, for things that are sprouting around Purim time, we'll inspect by Purim time, but there are certain kilayim, certain plants that are only sprouting around Chalamayid time. Those will inspect by Chalamayid time. V'chad amar kan bizroim kan birakos. But also the other possibility is that one is talking about seeds, or better stated, grain, and one is talking about vegetables. So we'll say they're pretty much both giving the same answer, which is different things sprout at different times. So in fact, there is not one kilayim inspection date, But in fact, there's 2 kilayim inspection dates. So for the early crops, right, or for the grain crops, we'll go ahead and we'll inspect around Purim time. And for the vegetable and later sprouting crops, we'll check around Chol Hamoed time. Beautiful. Amar Rav Asi Rabbi Yochanan, lo shanu ela she nitzan nikar, aval nitzan nikar yotzin alehen. So Rabbi Asi says, furthermore again, we only say, lo shanu ela, right? If you look at Rashi, lo shanu, then yotzin kodim adar kodim chol shamoid. But Rabbi Asi just says, by the way, these dates of adar and chol hamoed is also only assuming that the kilayim did not sprout. Aval nitzan nikar yotzin alein. But I will say, ultimately again, if you have a plant that sprouts even earlier than adar, then what? We would go out earlier than Adar. I was like, what the Gemara is pointing out over here is these dates that are given are just dates that are tied to agricultural cycle. But if you have kilayim that's sprouting earlier, we would go out earlier, even than Adar, to inspect that. Okay? So the Gemara says, Ma'ishna b'chalo shamoid dinafkinan. So we'll say, why chol hamoed? Otherwise, we'll say, we have to just ask the following question. What's coming out according to the Gemara is that halacha l'maisa, when do you go out to inspect about kilayim? When do you go out? Whenever you know that it's going to be growing, right? So depending on what time of the year. So why? So in other words, the Mishnah seems to place this process of searching for kilayim dafka during Chol Hamoed, right? So what is this Chol Hamoed activity, right? Six Flags was sold out, so, right? So let's go look for kilayim. I was going to say, so why is this dafka? Why is this dafka done during Chol Hamoed? So I'll say this is fast. Listen to this. Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yochanan, mishum schar peula demosli gaban. It's very simple because you could find people to work for cheaper amounts during Chol Hamoed. Now we'll say, look at Rashi. Rashi says mishum schar peula demosli gaban. Kilomar sheyachal liskar polim bezal lefi she'eno oskin b'malacha b'chol shana. We'll say you're not supposed to work on Chol Hamoed. Not supposed to work on Chol Hamoed. So because a person is not supposed to work on Chol Hamoed, people are, remember again, this is our whole sugya. The only type of work you're allowed to do on Chol Hamoed is what? Davar ha'avod. Most people, I will say, don't have davar ha'avod work. So therefore, really, and this is important to halakha in general, one ideally is not supposed to work. You're not supposed to go into work during Chol Hamoed, unless a person really has to, because it's a davar ha'avod. But one is not supposed to work during Chol Hamoed, which means that you have available workers. And I will say not only that, but you could hire those workers at a discounted price. Since they're not working anyway, you're not taking them away from something. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, they are available. The mostly gabon. So the Gemara is supposed to say, now what do you see from this? Amar Rav Zivid v'tim Rav Mishar sheshma mina ki ya'avina lohu schar mitrumas halishka ya'avina lohu. So what do you see from here? You see, I will say, where are these workers paid from? Where are these workers paid from? They're paid from Beis HaMikdash treasury. Now that's when there is a Beis HaMikdash. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, they're paid from the communal funds, from tzedakah funds, from communal funds. So I'll say, interestingly enough, how do you know they're paid from communal funds, from either Beis HaMikdash funds or from communal funds? Because I will say, here's the interesting part. When you're dealing with communal funds, you're obligated to find a bargain. Right? So the idea is, if we're paying these people from private funds, we don't have to ask them to go with Chol Hamoed. We can ask them to go anytime, or whatever it costs, it costs. The fact that we're using communal funds, that's why we dafka use them on Chol Hamoed. Why? Because workers are cheaper on Chol Hamoed than they are the rest of the year, since they're not working any. So you say during the rest of the year, if I want someone to look for kilayim, what do I have to do? I have to make sure I'm paying them at least as much as what? As they're making from their regular job. Well, in Chol Hamoed, that doesn't apply because most of the polim are not working anyway. So because of that, I can hire them at a discounted rate. And I both say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, that's in the communal funds benefit. Because when utilizing communal funds, one is obligated to ensure that they are used in the most, in the most, economical way. So in the most, it's not even economical. It's, we'll call it just appropriate way, right? One is obligated to ensure that in general, communal funds, tzedakah funds, are used in a way that stretches the communal dollar to the greatest degree possible. Therefore, by definition, we hire the workers on Chol Hamoed because you can get them for a cheaper amount. Incredible. V'yad kama. So we'll say, here's an interesting challenge just with kilayim. I will say, how much kilayim do you have to remove from a field? In other words, let's take a simple example. I have a grain field and I have grapes growing in that field. So how much grape, right? How much grape growth is problematic that I would be obligated to go ahead and remove it from the field? So the Gemara says, I'll give you the shear. Amar Shmuel bar Yitzchak ki osa sheshaninu kol sa'ah. So I will say, anytime, let's say you have a sa'ah of grain, sheyesh barova, amadei sheyesh barova, that has 1/4 of a kab, which is a 24th of a sa'ah, zera mimin achar yimai. So I will say, essentially, so if you have a sa'ah of grain and 1/24th of a sa'ah of grapes growing there, that has to be uprooted. So I will say, which tells you something very interesting, that you could have, if you have less than a 24th of a sa'ah of grapes growing in a sa'ah's worth of wheat, you're not halachically obligated to uproot that. It's got to be at least a 24th of the growth of the primary field in order to have an obligation to uproot it. So now the image that we're painting over is as follows. So what's happening? Whether it's Rosh Chodesh Adar, Purim, Chol Moed, Beis Din is sending out people to inspect for kilayim. We like Chol Moed because you can get workers at a bargain on Chol Moed. Good. So Gemara says, now what are the workers doing? They're going ahead and they're uprooting the kilayim. So Gemara says, interesting. Vatanya hiskinu sheimaf kirin kala sadekula. So Gemara said, we have another brisa. The other brisa that says that if the messengers of the Beis Din found that someone was having kilayim grow in their field, Beis Din would make that field hefker. Right? A pretty strong penalty. So we'll say, but which one is it? Are we uprooting kilayim or making fields hefker? Which one is this? Lo kasha, let's listen to this. Kan kodem takana, kan li achar takana. Both say, there was an evolution of the takana of kilayim. Listen to this. Tisanya, this is incredible. Barishona hayu okrenu mashlich lefnei behemton. So we'll say, in the beginning, the way it used to work was as follows. Beis Din would send out messengers to go ahead and search out kilayim, and they would come to a field where there was kilayim. What would the workers do? What would the workers of Beis Din do? They would uproot the kilayim and they would just throw it on a field, right? They would literally uproot and just throw it. Now the Gemara says they would throw it before the animals. The idea is they would just uproot it and leave it in the field. And the animals of the field owner would eat it. Vayu balabatim, smechen shtei smachos. And about say the owner of the field was besimcha. Why was he besimcha? And number one, someone just weeded my field for free. And someone also fed my animals. So we'll say, so listen to this. So the guy, we'll call him Ruvain, who was growing kilayim in his field. Okay, we'll say, he didn't have in mind to grow kilayim, he just wasn't taking care of his kilayim issue. So now the workers of Beis Din come along, they uprooted the kilayim, and they threw it in front of the animals. So double simcha. Number one, somebody weeded my field, and number two, somebody fed my animals. Givaldik. And I both say, now you want to talk about disincentivizing people to get rid of kilayim, this is it, right? This is it. I will say, right, the worst thing you could possibly do is pay people not to work. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Good. I guess Chazal were ahead of their times. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, next, hiskinu she'okinu mashlichan ala drachim. So fine, what was the extra? So what did they do? So they went and they weeded, they pulled up the kilayim, they didn't throw it in front of the animals, they threw it in front of on the street. Still, the landowners were still very happy. Why are they happy? It's true, their animals weren't getting fed, but what? Their fields were getting weeded for free. So again, remember, the chap over here is, the takana is not working. In other words, the whole idea of Beis Din going ahead and sending workers to the fields to uproot kilayim was a penalty. Beis Din's coming down to your property and Beis Din's uprooting your illegal growths. The problem is, everybody's more than happy to let Beis Din come down and take care of their kilayim problem. You've got free labor. All right, it was nice when they fed my animals also. Now they're not feeding my animals, they're just uprooting the kilayim, fine. So Beis Din realized it's not working. So Rabbi said it's not working because you haven't created a mechanism that disincentivizes the growth of kilayim. Therefore, what happened? Hiskin shim afkirin kalasadekula. Beis Din now instituted a new halacha, which was what? If Beis Din comes to your field and they find that you are going and growing kilayim, what's going to happen? Beis Din will make your field own. So let's remember again, Beis Din has the power to take your property. the concept of hefker, base, and hefker. It's similar to like eminent domain, right? Although eminent domain, I think they have to take it for some other greater public use. But Lamaisa Basin has the power to take your property. So therefore, Rabosai, when they saw that sending Poland, sending workers there to uproot Kilayim was not having the desired effect, they said, if we come to your field and we find Kilayim, again, the illegal amount of growth, 1/24th, 1/20 or more, we're going to make your field hefker. So Rabosai, that's an incentive to take care of your Kilayim problem. Beautiful. So we'll say Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, Moshchen es hamayim mi'ilan le'ilan, o bilvat shel yashkes chalasada. So listen to this. So we'll say continuing along in the case over here. So still chalamayit, you can still go ahead and channel water from one tree to another. So we'll say, so the imagery over here is as follows. You have a tree, and there's water pooling around tree A. But tree B is not getting water. So what do you want to do? You just want to dig. And when I say dig, by the way, this can be with your foot, right? You want to go ahead and create the channel from tree A to tree B to allow the water to flow from tree A to tree. So Elazar ben Yaakov says that is mutter, as long as you don't end up watering the entire field. Look at Rashi. Moshchin amayim mi'ilin la'ilan, dahavi kisade beis hashalchin, the psida yisera ika. So the idea over here is because this is considered to be a loss. Again, it's the same principle as the previous Mishnah. If I don't water tree B will die. That's the case over here. And therefore, this is a davar ha'avid. This is a significant loss. Channeling the water from tree A to tree B is not considered to be tircha yisera, right? It's not a crazy effort. And therefore, I'm permitted to do it. I just can't end up watering the entire field. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Zuraim shloshas lifnei hamoed, liyashkem hamoed. Ultimately, again, if there are seeds that you did not water before Chalamayid, or plants that you did not water before Chalamayid, you can't water them on Chalamayid. I will say the idea being is, if it's not urgent enough to water it before Chalamayid, then what? It's not urgent enough to allow you to do it on Chalamayid itself. Because I will say not every plant, nor not every seed needs to be watered all the time. So again, if you didn't water it before Chalamayid, you can't water it on Chalamayid. The Chachamim matirim bazeh ubazeh. The Chacham allow both. I will say, so the Chacham allow you, number one, to water seeds on Chalamayid, even if they weren't watered before Chalamayid. That's number one. And number two, the Chachamim actually not only allow you to channel water from tree A to tree B, but they allow you to what? Water the entire field. Now Rashi says over here, this reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa on Chalamayid, you're even permitted to water a beis habal. Right, you're even permitted to water a field that is sustained by rainwater. We quoted that shita on Beis Aleph. We've never explained it, but we've quoted it. We'll get into it now. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda, Im Haisa Sadem Mitunenes Mutter. Supposed to listen to this case. If you have a field, look at Rashi. Amar Rav Yehuda, Had Amar Rabbi Elazar, Avalo Yashkes Asade Kula, Avalem Haisa Sadem Mitunenes Lacha V'Yevesha Mutter Lashkosa. Af agav the habib sade beis habal. The chayvan the hab yalacha ad hashta ilamash klahab tzedisir. But listen to this. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in the Mishnah said it like this. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov say, tree A has water pooling in front of it. Tree B doesn't have water. What can you do? Channel water from A to B. What can't you do? Water the entire field. Comes on Rabbi Yehuda and says, but there's an exception. If it's what's called a sada mitunenes. Sada mitunenes means a field that is normally moist, but is now dried up. Now, I say this is talking about even a field that is sustained normally by rainwater. Something's happened, and now the field is dry. If you don't water that field, what's going to happen? The produce is going to die. This now becomes a hefsid meruba, and therefore, Allah l'maisa, you would be permitted to water such a field. So we'll say, what this is essentially is a case like this. This is a case where essentially a base habal, right, which is a field that is normally taken care of by rainwater, could kind of become a beis hashalchin, an irrigated field, if for some reason, again, it just dries up. So the Gemara says, Tanya, that supports this, when we said that you can't water a field on Chalamayid, that's only talking about plants or seeds that were not watered before Chalamayid. So if it wasn't watered before Yom Tiv, then obviously means it doesn't need to be watered all of the time. And therefore, Allah Chalamayid can't water it on Yom Tiv. But if you have plants which were watered before Chalamayid, then what? Then you're permitted to go ahead and water them on Chalamayid itself. Similarly, again, if it was a field that is normally moist, but for some reason has now dried up, mutter. You're permitted to water that field because Rabbi say failure to water that field will result in a loss of hefsed meruba. Therefore, you're permitted. Ve'im mashkin sadeh garir b'moed. So I'll say, but you can't go ahead and water a sadeh garid. Excuse me. What's a sadeh garid? Look at Rashi. Yevesha me'olam. We'll say if you have a field that's naturally dry. But I guess in agriculture there are certain things that don't really require a lot of moisture to grow. So a sadeh garid is a field that is normally dry. So a field that is normally dry, you can't water on chalamayid. Okay. The Chachamim say that Allah chalamaisa, you're allowed to water a sadeh garid, and you're even allowed to water seeds that were not watered before chalamayid. I will say, as we're going to see, whenever we see Chachamim in this context, Chachamim usually reflected with the view of Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir just has a very permissive view when it comes to watering things on chalamayid. Again, we'll discuss why that is. Amar Ravina. So Ravina says, Shema Mina. We really learn something very important from here. Hai tarbitza shari letarbutze bechola demoada. So Ravina says, what do you see from here? Look at Rashi. Hai tarbitza. Tarbitza, Rashi says, is a gina, is a garden. So this garden, shari letarbutze bechola demoada. Rashi says, shari letarbutze lezalef alei mayim afagav veleka psidel letarbutze lahashkos lashon ein mechabnin deimar bitzin hanu hashka porta kadeshiyatsu hayarakos. So also listen to this. So Ravina says, what do you see from here? That you're allowed to sprinkle some water on a field on chalamayid. That's tarbitza. You could sprinkle some water on a field on chalamayid. Now, interestingly enough, why would you be doing this? Rashi says over here, the reason you do this ultimately is to go ahead and allow the vegetables to come out in a more easy fashion. So the Gemara says, because after all, sadeh garid my taima. So ultimately, again, why are you permitted to go ahead and water a sadeh garid, which I will say is a field that is naturally dry? No, I will say we'll have to stop over here. We're going to pick up with this Ravina about the tarbitza, right? About watering the garden patch. And we'll pick up with that tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone.